Good afternoon. I'm Carlin Bowman, a senior fellow here at AEI, and I'd like to welcome all of you to tonight's Bradley Lecture by our former colleague, Henry Olsen. First, a few housekeeping announcements. We'd like to invite all of you to the reception after this lecture. It'll be right outside. And also a brief announcement about our next lecture, next month's lecture. On January 19th, Karl Rove will give his first Washington lecture about his new book, The Triumph of William McKinley, Why the Election of 1896 Still Matters. All of us are looking forward to that. Now let me introduce Henry Olsen. Henry is a senior fellow at the Ethics and Public Policy Center, where he studies and writes about American politics and the challenges facing American conservatism. We at AEI were very fortunate to have Henry as a colleague from 2006 to 2013. He served as vice president and director of AEI's National Research Initiative. We still count him as an important colleague and friend and are delighted that he's part of AEI's Election Watch team. Henry had many and varied administrative responsibilities here at AEI, which made it impossible for him to do the research needed for this book, so he moved to EPPC to write it. We're delighted to be co-sponsoring this event with the Ethics and Public Policy Center. Its title is The Four Faces of the Republican Party, the Fight for the 2016 GOP Nomination, and his co-author is Dante Scala of the University of New Hampshire. The book is available on Amazon, and it would make a wonderful Christmas gift. There are flyers that you can look at for the book at the registration desk. As important as this book is, Henry's also working on another book that is scheduled to appear in January of 2017. The working title is The Rise of the New Deal Republicans, How the FDR-Reagan Consensus Can Save Today's GOP. That book will be available from HarperCollins. Henry and I first bonded at AEI over our discussions of an obscure group in politics that the pollsters call some college. This large segment of the electorate was mostly ignored until recently, yet they have a near-perfect record of voting for the winner. We soon learned that we had a passion for obscure election demographics, and it's been a pleasure analyzing those with him. Henry has developed a typology of his own, which he will be discussing tonight. As someone who's watched politics in this town for a very long time, I can say that there are very few people who have had truly unique insights to what makes this complex country tick politically. Henry is one of those people. He also has the distinction of having actually run for office in California many years ago, giving him a perspective that few political analysts bring to the subject of elections. This has been a wild election year, as I think we all know. I'm eager to hear from Henry about how he expects it to play out and why. Please join me in welcoming Henry Olsen.
Thank you very much, Carlin. It is always a delight to be back at AEI. This is one of those homecomings that makes me feel like the kid who went off to college and left when I was 17, and now I come back as a college graduate. I hope I don't have the hubris that most 21-year-olds have. So with respect to the four faces of the Republican Party, you can imagine the reaction in official Washington to that, because most people in official Washington think that Republicans already have two faces, and I'm telling them that they have four. But Norm, it's even worse than you thought. But who are these four faces, and why do we? What do they mean? Why are they the crucial way of looking at the election? Well, beyond the negative connotation of two faces, most conventional wisdom says that the political side of the Republican Party has two faces. It's divided into an establishment that is epitomized by a Boehner or a Bush or a Cheney, and outsiders and insurgents who tend to be movement conservatives. After the Tea Party successes of 2010 and to a lesser degree of 2014, many have questioned whether or not the motion and the majority are now with the supposed outsiders or the insurgents, that the movement conservatives are now a majority of the Republican Party. Indeed, one can argue that the Ted Cruz for President campaign is based on the thesis that that is the correct typology, and that, in fact, the outsiders and the alleged insurgents are now the majority. What we're here to show you, or what I'm here to show you, and my co-author and I do in the book, is that this view is neat, simple, and wrong. That there are, in fact, four factions in the Republican Party. only 2 of them would fit into what you would consider to be the movement conservative, that in fact in Republican presidential years, in part because places that don't elect Republicans to Congress do elect delegates to the conventions, moderates are an important faction. And in fact, the single largest faction in the Republican Party, and the group that always backs the winner, and the group that decides who will be the nominee, is the group that tells pollsters they are somewhat conservative, and that they're the people who gravitate towards the Doles, the Romneys, the Bushes, the sort of people that the movement tends to disdain as establishment moderates. Breaking it into 4 faces allows us to answer some questions, the puzzles that I have up here. Why is it that a party that's conservative not nominate the most conservative nominee? Why do they nominate the next in line? Why is it that certain types of candidates that the media thinks are surprises, like the moderate John McCain, or in 2008, the very religious Mike Huckabee, or in 1996, the very social conservative Pat Buchanan, why do they emerge when seemingly there's only 2 factions? So the 4 factions of the party are moderates and liberals. They're roughly 20 to 25%, sometimes when somebody can excite them, almost as much as 30% nationwide. And they tend to like candidates, as I'll get into in a minute, who are the antithesis of the modern Republican Party. The somewhat conservatives are the single largest faction. They tend to be 35 to 40% of the Republican Party. And as you'll see, they like people who are conservative in both senses of the word. They like people who adhere to the ideals of American movement conservatism, strong defense, traditional values, free markets. And they also like conservatism when it means caution, or as I say, the disposition of the Burkean conservative. They like the ideals of American movement conservatism, but they do not like the voluble, immediate desire for immediate change. They like stability, and they see that as a conservative value. The other 2 groups are the 2 components of what one might call the movement conservative. The very conservative evangelicals are people who, it's almost self-explanatory now. They were surprised in 2008 when they pushed Mike Huckabee into the final 2. Now most people in Washington understand who they are. They're about 20 to 25% nationwide, and they like people who are strongly passionate about their beliefs, who believe that America is in decline, and who want to move the country quickly towards a recovery of American traditional ideals. They like people who talk about faith in the public square a lot. And then you've got the people who dominate a lot of the conversation in Washington, but who are actually the smallest group in the Republican Party, and that's the movement conservative, or the very conservative secular. And that's somebody who is not an evangelical. They can be people of faith from other faiths, but they are people who are not primarily motivated by social issues or by religious affiliation in the way that they actually cast their votes. To get to be a nominee, what you do is you basically do a nomination 2-step. The first thing you have to do is you have to become a champion of one of those 4 factions. And as we'll see, each of the early carve-out states favors one of these factions. So that if you're trying to become, for example, the candidate of the very conservative evangelical set, you must win Iowa. If you want to be the candidate of the moderate set, you must win New Hampshire, and so forth. Once in the early race, you have established that you are the dominant leader of one faction. The other candidates usually drop out. We have not had more than 3 serious candidates go past South Carolina in the nomination cycle for at least 20 years, and I think going back as far as perhaps even 1980. The race winnows very, very quickly. You then have to build a coalition, because some factions will be leaderless, either in the early stage of the race, in the mid stage of the race when it's 3 or 4 candidates, but definitely by the time you come down to a one-on-one race, which usually happens by mid-March, you must be the favorite of more than one faction, and your message must be acceptable to one of or 2 of the other groups in addition to the faction that you lead. If you can't do that, you will lose the one-on-one, because when you have a one-on-one, people who are adherents of the other factions will make a lesser of 2 evils choice. They will say, I may not like Huckabee and I may not like McCain in 2008, but I'd rather have McCain than Huckabee, or I'd rather have Huckabee and McCain. So you have to be playing a long game and a short game simultaneously. So let's go through each of the factions a little bit. This is based, just for the data nerds, this is based on all available entrance and exit poll data, which we receive from the Roper Center, not just the public crosstabs that you can get on CNN or some of the websites, but actually the data that we then were able to crunch and divide and see things that are not publicly reported. All of that information is in our book, pre-available for order on Amazon. Moderates and liberals. This is the group that perhaps most recently is epitomized by the failed candidacy of John Huntsman, but in more successful times was the group that propelled John McCain first to prominence and then ultimately to the nomination. They are the least Republican of the group. They are the most likely to say that they are independent, or even some Democrats crossing over in states that permit people who don't have party registration or permit people who are not Republicans to vote. They are the group least likely to like the Tea Party and most likely to dislike the Tea Party. They are the least likely to be religiously affiliated and the least likely, when they are, to be religiously observant. This is the only faction in the Republican Party that is pro-choice. There are pro-lifers who are moderate, but by and large, year after year, when you're asked, they favor some form of legalized abortion, if not as strongly as some liberal Democrats. This is the pro-choice faction in the Republican Party. And this is a group that likes two things. They like experience, but they particularly like people who are truth tellers. They like people who want to bring the country together, but like to tell truth to power. This was McCain's big single largest factor in his favor with moderates, and it's something that actually is helping Donald Trump among this group. Now, this group, as you would expect if you know if you're a political historian, is focused in the Northeast. Take a look at these bars. New Hampshire, in the blended average of exit polls, over 45% of Republican primary voters in New Hampshire tell pollsters they are moderates or liberals. This is the single largest faction, and if somebody can win moderates by 15 points or more, they will win the New Hampshire primary unless they are completely hated by every other faction in the state. Northeast, I could have added Rhode Island onto this list. It's all 40% or more. But look at the Midwest. Look at the Great Lakes. This is either competitive with somewhat conservatives or in some cases greater than somewhat conservatives in Republican primaries. And this is not a one-off thing. This is blended data from each of the three last races, and the data don't change very much from year to year. The reason movement conservatives lose Michigan, Ohio, Wisconsin, is because there are more moderates than movement conservatives in these states. And they vote, as you would expect from the profile that I gave you, they vote against the movement conservative candidate time and time again. As you would expect, they're weakest in the South, but even in the South, they're not a small percentage. South Carolina, for example, moderates and liberals usually average about 30% of the primary electorate. That's not a trivial amount, and that's why John McCain beat Mike Huckabee in 2008, is that he ran up a large margin among the 30% who are moderates and won enough among the somewhat conservatives to eke out a narrow 3-point victory. The second group is the most important one. This is the largest group. This is the somewhat conservatives. And I struggled with this because I grew up being a political nerd, going to Republican Party fundraisers in the 1970s. That was fun, let me tell you that. But people who didn't do that kind of had a hard time when I described to them what is a somewhat conservative. And I finally hit on something that resonated with people. These are the people who think that John Boehner is just okay with them. These are the people who like his calm, they like his deliberation, they believe he is committed to conservative principles, but they also like the fact that he's a tactician. They are the sort of person who in a Boehner-Cruz fight would not see Boehner as a rhino, but rather see Boehner as an authentic Republican. The somewhat conservative is a strong Republican. They are 3-1, tell pollsters that they are Republicans, not independents. They are supportive, but not in love with the Tea Party. They go to church, but not as much as some others, but not as little as moderates. They support restricting abortion, but they tend to be more moderate, as we'll see when we get to the very conservative evangelicals. Very conservative evangelicals tend to want to restrict and eliminate abortion in all cases, whereas for the somewhat conservative, it's just in most or many cases. Again, they're pro-life, but with a distinction. And what they like more than anything else is reliability. They like candidates who can win, they like candidates with gravitas, and they like candidates who project the idea that they can govern from day one. They like Bob Dole. They liked Mitt Romney in 2012. They were the ones who swung behind George W. Bush in the one-on-one face-off with McCain. These are the voters who decide who becomes the Republican nominee because they occupy the median position in the Republican ideological firmament. They are also distributed roughly in equal numbers everywhere. Moderates are tilted to the coast and to the northeast. As we'll see later, very conservative evangelicals are tilted where you would think they would be, which is the South and the border states. Somewhat conservatives are everywhere. Somewhat conservatives are 30 to 35, in some cases 40% of the electorate in virtually every state. And if you were to go through polls, every state-level poll for the last 4 cycles, you would find that no one wins a state without either winning the somewhat conservatives or losing them by a very narrow margin. What's true on the national level is true in every state contest as well. This is the group that people in Washington understand the least, but in terms of power, have the most. The next group is the very conservative evangelical. And again, we are now familiar with them. They are very strong Republicans. They are very strongly in love with the Tea Party. They are extremely devoted to their religion. They are extremely opposed to abortion. And they have priorities. Now they are voting partially on Tea Party priorities, but the candidate who wins their hearts must be somebody who talks about faith and God in the public square. We can trace Ted Cruz's rise from a fringe candidate into a serious candidate precisely from when in 2014 he starts incorporating religious messages and courting the evangelical wing of the party, in addition to running as a strong constitutionalist and a champion of the secular Tea Party. This is a values voter. Now, I know that here in Washington, we know that the Family Research Council hosts the Values Voters Summit, and that means one thing to that constituency, but what it really means is that what they want to know is where your heart is. The policies, the experience, much less important than the principles that you hold and the depth of your conviction. This is the group that is most likely to back people over time who have had no governing experience. Pat Buchanan. In 2000, 45% of them in Iowa backed either Gary Bauer, a think tank head, or Alan Keyes, a minor bureaucrat, over George W. Bush in the Iowa caucus, because they were convinced that each man had passion and beliefs that set them apart. As you can see, this is a group that is virtually absent from the Northeast. It dominates the South. But look at those Midwest numbers. With the exception of the Iowa caucuses, and if we had entrance poll data, I would tell you Kansas and Minnesota, but we don't have the data to support what I can see from election results. They tend to be less than 20% of the vote in the primary states. And this is why Rick Santorum could not break through. This is why Mike Huckabee could not break through. And this is the greatest challenge that any movement conservative candidate has. There just aren't a lot of them in the key delegate-rich Midwestern states. And look at California. California will send 172 delegates, largely on a winner-take-all basis. Fewer than 20% of California Republicans say they are very conservative evangelicals. This, too, is one reason why movement conservative candidates usually have problems in today's Republican Party, as opposed to Ronald Reagan's Republican Party, of winning in California. Now the last group, the group that we hear a lot about, but actually are pretty small. This is the very conservative secular. This is also the bedrock of the Republican Party in terms of people who say they are Republican identifiers. They love the Tea Party. They're not as devoted to their religion. This is where many soft libertarians, which is, say, libertarians who participate in the Republican Party as opposed to absenting themselves from two-party politics and being an LP member, this is where they come in. They're for restricting abortions, but is an incredibly low priority for them. They had traditionally have cared about taxes and the size of government, and today they are motivated by opposition to illegal immigration. This has been evident in the polls going back in 2008 and 2012, but we can see it particularly now. This is a motivating issue for them. They too, however, are values voters. If you ask, what candidate quality is most important to you, they will choose being a true conservative or shares my values over electability or experience. This makes them more like the very conservative evangelical and less like the somewhat conservative. There are a small number virtually everywhere. There are some of them in the Deep South. There are some of them in the Northeast. There are some of them in the Midwest. They are particularly important in Nevada, in part because it's a caucus state, and in part because 25% of the electorate in Nevada in the last two caucuses was Mormon. And Mormons may be deeply religious, but they are not evangelical because of their theology. So they can't answer that question on the exit survey to say they are part of the evangelical movement. You can see they're a little bit stronger in California than they are perhaps in other places. They run roughly equal in terms of size with very conservative evangelicals there. Again, a legacy of the Western soft libertarian type of Republican conservatism. But this favorite, going back here, in the past they've liked urbane people. They were the people who liked Jack Kemp in 1988. They were the people who liked Steve Forbes in 1996 and 2000. They were the people who, odd as it might seem, liked Mitt Romney in 2008, having decided they would prefer him over Fred Thompson. And in 2012, while after flirting with Newt Gingrich and Rick Perry, they swung firmly behind Romney in the later states. But because of their small number, their candidates tend to flame out very, very quickly. No favorite of the very conservative seculars has made it past an early primary without also being a favorite of another group that's larger. George W. Bush, for example, narrowly beat Steve Forbes among these groups in the early primaries in 2000, but he was also winning pluralities among very conservative evangelicals and had his strongest support in the somewhat conservative group. These candidates, these people tend to be looking for a second best choice very early in the primary process. And they usually, when faced with a choice between a very conservative evangelical candidate and a somewhat conservative Romney-type candidate, narrowly back the somewhat conservative. This is one of the main reasons why in a one-on-one race, religiously inspired but not secularly, fiscally inspired conservatives have tended to flame out pretty quickly because their very conservative brethren end up supporting the somewhat conservative over the purely religious conservative. But enough of the background. What you want to learn is, what does this mean for today? How's the race going to play out based on how these four factions play? And fortunately, we can help with that. Here's the early voting states. The RNC has set and finally been able to make it stick. There's only four what they call carve-out states. This is the order that they vote in. Iowa first, the caucuses, New Hampshire primaries, South Carolina primaries, and Nevada caucuses. Each state strongly backs one of the factions. Take a look at these numbers. The top bar in all of these is moderates or liberals. Second is somewhat conservatives. Third is very conservative evangelicals. And fourth is very conservative seculars. You want to know why everyone is jumping into Iowa and talking about God and seeking out the endorsement of pastors? Look at how large the very conservative evangelical vote is, almost as large as the somewhat conservative. No one has won Iowa without getting a plurality of the very conservative evangelical vote in the last three races. And this is why Ted Cruz has been surging in the polls, as he's beginning to consolidate that vote in the state of Iowa. But then take a look at New Hampshire. It's very rare to see somebody who wins in Iowa in these days go on and win in New Hampshire as well. And the reason why is the electorates are completely different. The moderates here are almost 50% of the vote. The smallest faction is the very conservative evangelical. This is the group that propelled John McCain to his supposed upset victory in 2000. He won over a majority of the vote of moderates, and that being that they were almost a majority of the vote meant that he carried the state handily. This is a state that had moderates backed somebody in a united way, could have propelled John Huntsman, for example, to into the frontier. But he split moderates with Ron Paul, and that allowed Mitt Romney, whose strength was somewhat conservative, to win the crucial New Hampshire primary. Third state is South Carolina. South Carolina's electorate is the only of the 4 carve-out states that basically mirrors the nation very closely. You have about 30% moderates, you have about 30% somewhat conservatives, you have a little bit higher proportion of evangelicals than in the nation as a whole, but still, they're the third faction at around 27 or 28%, and very few of those secular, very conservative voters. Winners in South Carolina have been winners of the somewhat conservative vote and combining them with one of the other 2 of the large factions. George W. Bush won the very conservative evangelicals. John McCain, when he beat Mike Huckabee in 2008, won the moderates. Nevada has been a caucus that's not been receiving much play in the last 2 races, largely because Mitt Romney had it sewed up because of the large Mormon population. They were a quarter of the vote, and Romney got almost 90% of them. When you start the election with about 22% in the bank, it's hard for somebody else in a multi-candidate race to catch up. This time we don't have a Mormon contender. Nevada is going to become very important. And this is a state that very strongly favors Ted Cruz. This is a state that favors fiscal conservatism. It favors Tea Party conservatism. And as long as he's not anathema to the Mormon population, this is a state that it would actually be a surprise to me if he were to win or do well in one of the first 3 states if he were to lose Nevada. So then we move to March 1st, the SEC primary, the Southeastern Athletic Conference primary, because so many conservative states decided to hold their primaries on the same day. And you can see this, how this is supposed to help the conservative candidate by the large proportion in the 3rd bar. Look at how many very conservative evangelicals there are in the states that vote on March 1st. Easily the largest faction in Oklahoma, substantially ahead in Tennessee, equal to the next largest faction in Georgia, equal to or almost equal to the next largest faction in Alabama. These are all states that religiously themed conservatives have won in the last 2 races, and these 2 are states that Cruz or another candidate who were to come through as a religiously themed candidate are banking on to win early. You can see that there are some states that don't fit in here. Massachusetts is one, Vermont is another. These always back the moderate hope. If there's a candidate that's emerged as an establishment choice or a somewhat conservative choice or a moderate choice, these are their victory states on March 1st. States that'll be competitive are Georgia and Virginia, and one that I don't have up here because we don't have any data, but which look very similar to those 2, and that's North Carolina. Those states are states that, like South Carolina, have equal numbers of each of the large 3 factions, and so consequently in a multi-candidate race, a non-very conservative candidate can eke out a victory here and consequently deny some much-needed momentum to the very conservative champion. Then we get into the later part, and here, this is crucial. I want you to draw a line in your mind between Mississippi and Florida. The RNC has a rule that's being enforced this time that says if you vote before March 15th, you must award your delegates proportionally unless somebody gets 50% of the vote. But after March 15th, you can do whatever you want. Note, March 1st, all of the conservative states are in this proportionality window. If we were to show other states, we would have shown Louisiana voting on March 5th, Kansas voting on March 5th, Kentucky voting on March 5th. Virtually every state that has strong, very conservative evangelical presence will vote in the proportionality window. And Louisiana, as I mentioned, and Mississippi are no strangers to that. Florida and everything else votes on March 15th. All of these are winner-take-all states. Florida is a statewide winner-take-all state. Illinois, most of the delegates are at the congressional district level, but that's that's a directly elected, but in effect, it's a winner-take-all system. Missouri, it's a winner-take-most at the congressional district levels. Ohio and Arizona are statewide winner-take-alls. Look at how the demographics in these states differ from the states that voted before. You get to March 15th, suddenly the electorates are much less very conservative. Suddenly the moderates are either the largest faction or the second largest faction. The very conservative evangelical faction is less than 20% in every state except Florida. The very conservative seculars may get up as high in soft libertarian Arizona to 15%, but even combined, they barely exceed the moderates. These are states that have been the death knells of movement conservative candidates in each of the last few races where that movement conservative did not also win over the party's sensible center. George W. Bush was able to do that. He won these states. He became the nominee. Mike Huckabee, Rick Santorum, unable to do that, unable to become the nominee. For all you hear about what's going to happen on March 1st and March 8th and on March 5th, if somebody is left standing on March 15th who is not the very conservative candidate, they stand a very good chance of gaining all of those delegates back and more by doing very well in the post-March 1st states that are significantly less conservative. And then it gets even worse for the very conservative candidates because the states that vote late are the states that aren't very conservative. Look at Wisconsin. Mike Huckabee and Rick Santorum have each had to drop out after losing the Wisconsin primary in the last 2 cycles. Well, guess why? Look at the percentage of moderates in that election. Look at the percentage of somewhat conservatives. This is a state that does not historically back strong Tea Party-flavored, evangelical-flavored conservatism. This is a state that has those factions. Huckabee won some congressional districts in rural western Wisconsin, and Santorum did the same. But overall, this is a state that awards its delegates by winner-take-all, and it strongly favors the moderate to the somewhat conservative. Look at New York. Well, most movement conservatives prefer not to look at New York, but they'll send 92 delegates to Cleveland. And there are virtually no movement conservatives in New York. If it's a 2-person race, by the time it gets to New York in mid-April, you can expect almost all of those 92 delegates to be going to the non-movement conservative candidate. Connecticut and Delaware are proportional primaries. Then in June, on June 6th, you've got the big kahunas, California and New Jersey. California sends 172 delegates, winner take all, 3 delegates apiece in the congressional district. Traditionally, about 20 of these are locks for the moderate, somewhat conservative candidate. Very few are locks for the very conservative evangelical candidate. Remember the chart I showed you before? It's because there's a lot more of those voters. And the voters that there are tend to be low in a few congressional districts that elect Republicans. The many that elect delegates but elect very few Republicans or none to Congress tend to be disproportionately moderate. That's very good delegate news for the candidate of the moderate, somewhat conservative alliance. And New Jersey, well, New Jersey sends 51 delegates, statewide winner take all. One suspects, one knows what faction that will go for. What about the Donald? Donald Trump is somebody who is the only candidate who has introduced a factor that causes the 4 factions to be turned on its head. And that's because Donald Trump is effectively running a European-style class warfare campaign. For people who follow European politics, as I do, or my friend Tim back here does, the rage that's been happening in Europe is working-class protest parties that tend to be anti-immigration, anti-EU, and then have a mix of fiscal policies that fall between left and right. They can be for lower taxes and more spending. They can be for extending national health insurance and deregulation. Now, that's because what they're doing is they're representing the worldview of their faction, which is, in most European countries, between 12 and 25% of the electorate, depending on the straitened economic conditions and the strength of the party at hand. All the polls show that Donald Trump draws non-ideologically across the 4 factions, although he tilts slightly to the moderates, he tilts slightly towards men, and he tilts slightly towards the non-religious. He does, however, get strong support ideologically from all 4 factions. What he doesn't do is get support across 4 educational factions. Polls that have asked how much formal education have you received show that the less formal education you have received, the more likely you are to back Donald Trump. If you're a high school graduate, about 40% are backing Donald Trump. If you're a college dropout or you're an AA degree holder, the some college that Carlin introduced me to many years ago, probably about 30 to 35%, depending on the poll or the state. College graduate, below 30%. The people who hate Donald Trump the most in the Republican Party are the holders of postgraduate degrees. This shouldn't surprise anyone, but how many people in Washington in the conservative elites hold postgraduate degrees? How many of the large donors in the Republican Party have JDs, MBAs, or MAs? The party elite is disproportionately from the postgraduate world that finds Donald Trump's appeal incredulous. And guess what? If you were to go to Europe and you were to go to the cities of Westminster, the constituency of Westminster, which is where the British elite lives, you would find that UKIP is incredibly unpopular there. Again, the people who live there find the appeal of the working class person completely incredulous. David Cameron called them fruitcakes, loonies, and closet racists before he became prime minister. How many times have you heard people in the last couple of months say that about Trump and or his supporters? If you were to go to Stockholm, I could show you precincts in Stockholm where the Swedish elite live. They believe that the Swedish Democratic Party is equally as filled with fruitcakes, loonies, neo-Nazis, and racists, and they're now the leading party according to 2 polls in Sweden. Ignore their concerns, their strength will grow. This is the Donald's appeal. Whether he can sustain that is an open question. Typically, candidates for president, as opposed to proportional representation systems, you actually have to, you can't send a message. You actually have to choose a president. Typically, support for candidates like Trump drops the closer you get to election. He has so far sustained himself longer than many people thought, but we're still 2 months away from the first votes being cast, and probably about 3 weeks away from the tens of $millions of negative ads that'll start to blanket Iowa. We'll see if he can sustain, but he's the only candidate that creates a different factional breakdown than has existed in the Republican Party for as long as we have data. So what does this mean? All of this means the least likely scenario is what we call in our book the moderate dream. That would be somebody coming out who is a voice of moderation. Here we have Chris Christie, not because he would call himself a moderate, but because his support profiles in all of the polls, the more likely you are to say you are moderate, the more likely you are to say you like Chris Christie. Moderates would love to run against an evangelical. That is basically the dream scenario, because faced with the choice between an evangelical and a moderate, the other 2 factions of the party have shown that they care more about defeating the evangelical than they care about defeating the moderate. This would be about the only scenario under which somebody who is a strong champion of the moderates could actually prevail. Next least likely scenario is the reverse of that. This is the movement conservative dream. This is where instead of it being a purely religiously themed movement conservative, it's somebody like a Ted Cruz who gains support from both of the 2 movement conservative factions. So he comes out not with the support of 1 faction, but of 2. And he faces off against a moderate. Again, I don't think John Kasich would say that he's a moderate, but again, his profile support in New Hampshire, which is the only state he's got serious polling numbers in right now, is strongly moderate. You take a look at the cross groups, and if you say you're a moderate, John Kasich either leads in those polls or is a strong second. None of the other factions like him in New Hampshire. He would be the sort of person that a Ted Cruz would love to be able to fight against, because he believes that he would come out with 2 factions behind him, 1 faction behind Kasich, and you can split the third one 50-50, and that's a recipe for victory. That's the movement conservative dream. And when they think of insurgents versus establishment, that's what they're thinking the entire electorate is going to look like. This is a scenario that looked likelier when we were writing this book, but it's one that's proving to be less likely as the days go on, mainly because a religious conservative who is only a religious conservative seems unlikely to emerge at this point. Both Ben Carson and Ted Cruz, who are the 2 leading candidates among religious conservatives, also have strong bases among other factions as well. And Jeb Bush, who looked at the beginning of the race when we wrote our book as somebody who could emerge as a somewhat conservative favorite, has faded from view. And for him, too, his profile in New Hampshire, the only place where he has serious polling numbers outside of his home state of Florida, profiles strongly and tilts towards the moderate side. So that leaves what looks, if Donald Trump does not remake the Republican Party in his own image, which is to say the Gog of working class populism versus the Magog of elite privilege, as he might say, if he were to understand the Bible verse I just referenced, is the somewhat conservative versus the very conservative. And what happens in that race? What happens if, as many people say, it'll end up being Cruz versus Rubio? It's funny, this is the first time I've said the words Marco Rubio in the entire presentation. Well, very quietly, Marco Rubio has been gaining. And I take a look at polls going back to before the first debate, and every cycle of monthly polls, he has moved up about 2 points to the point where now he's basically running third, even with Cruz. And Cruz, too, has been gaining. You know, he started roughly where Rubio was, and he, too, has gained. So that now, depending on the poll, one is second or one is third, or they're both roughly tied with a Carson, who is falling. Why do I say this is the somewhat conservative versus the very conservative? Well, let me read you some data from the last 4 Quinnipiac polls. And Quinnipiac is a pollster that does regular national polls and always breaks out ideological cross-tabulations, unlike most national pollsters. In August, Cruz and Rubio were tied at 7%. In September, Rubio 9, Cruz 7. November, Rubio 14, Cruz 13. And in the one released a couple of days ago, Rubio 17, Cruz 16. Looks pretty even, doesn't it? Now let me read you the ideological breakdowns. The number I'm going to read is first very conservative, which is to say taking my 2 factions and combining them into one. Second, somewhat conservative. And third, moderate and liberal. Ted Cruz in August, 14% among very conservatives, 6 among somewhat conservatives, 0 among moderates. September, 15, 5, and 2. November, 26, 7, and 6. December, 29, 14, and 3. Now, don't take much stock in the decline from 6 to 3 among moderates. These numbers, the crosstabs are so small, cell size, that's well within the margin of error. But notice the broader trend. Cruz is gaining because he's lapping up the very conservative vote and getting a faction of the somewhat conservative vote. But he remains well below virtually any other candidate, including Carly Fiorina, among the third of the voters who are moderates and liberals. Marco Rubio, what's his look like? August, 5, 6, and 9. 5% very conservative, 6% somewhat conservatives, 9% moderates and liberals. September, we've started what's going to be a trend. 8, 14, and 7. It's a belt shape. 8% of very conservatives, 14% of somewhat conservatives, 7% of liberals. November, 12, 20, and 10. The gain is disproportionately among the somewhat conservatives. And in the December survey, 11, 26, and 15. So he's losing movement conservatives by almost 3 to 1 to Ted Cruz. But he's beating Ted Cruz among somewhat conservatives, which are a larger faction and more evenly distributed throughout the country, by almost 2 to 1. And he's beating Ted Cruz 5 to 1 among moderates and liberals. And remember what I mentioned. Kasich, Christie, Bush, Fiorina all profile more to the moderate side. When they drop out, they will then have, as I mentioned, a lesser of 2 evils choice. Do they prefer a Rubio or do they prefer a Cruz? You can draw your own conclusions, and I'll take questions. I remember enough of my AEI days to be able to say, wait for the mic, identify yourself, and give your affiliation. I'll take the questions now. Come on, it's politics in Washington. Somebody must have a question. Yes, ma'am. Wait for the mic. Thanks.
Okay. Thank you. Sharon Bovat, Voice of a Moderate. I represent Purple State women. I do a lot of research and actually sent an email to some friends on the Romney campaign saying you're going to lose after spending time in Colorado because of Prop 64, the legalization of marijuana. Now, I've talked to a lot of women that are really going to, their demographic will decide the election. And surprisingly, some are leaning towards Cruz because of the age. They just don't want to. Are you
talking about the general election or the primary?
Actually, as a president in general. I mean, these are Republican women moderates that will vote primarily for the Republican, but they will vote for Democrat if they really do not like that choice. These are the people that will change their minds. So in my mind, they're the people. But when you look at Rubio, what the concern is that he's a first-term senator and people don't want an inexperienced leader. Now, when you look at your data, what do you look at the age difference between Rubio and Cruz? Because Cruz is still, I think, a first term.
Yeah, I mean, I think which one is a year older than the other. I mean, the age difference between them is inconsequential. They're both mid-40s. They're both in their first term. Marco Rubio spent about a decade in the State House. Ted Cruz held no elective office prior to his run for the Senate. He held a point of office as Solicitor General. The data, I can only go with the data that public pollsters ask. And public pollsters, since campaign pollsters for some reason won't give me their data for attribution. I wonder why. But they're not asking those questions. I can't speak to the demographic that you're speaking to because the questions that are being asked aren't reflective of the concerns you mentioned, and they don't break down there's not enough people in the sample size to break down a demographic as narrow as you're talking about. So all I can point to is that if I were to simply do more than the Quinnipiac survey, the lack of support of Ted Cruz among self-declared moderates is pretty constant, and it's true at the state level, and it's true across national level. So I can only offer the data that I've got, which is that so far, public pollsters, whether they're polling in states or at the national level of a Republican primary electorate, find virtually no support for Ted Cruz among people who will tell pollsters they're moderates or liberals.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Yes, ma'am. Please wait for the microphone.
Thank you. My name is Li Yang. I just wonder, your poll is basically from the voters. There's no non-voters, I suppose. And so
The data are from entrance and exit polls of actual voters in each of the last 3 presidential cycles.
Right. But my question is now, it's like Black Lives Matters and a lot of people are voting for outsiders. So I just wonder, how do you take those into account? And what do you think about the Donald Trump, those unconstitutional phrase about immigration to ban from the U.S.?
I'm not going to talk about, there's 2 questions in that. The first question is, do I think the insider-outsider dynamic is going to be more important in this election? And the second question is, since I'm not a policy analyst, I'm a political analyst, I'm going to talk about the political impact of Trump's statements on Muslim immigration. First, with respect to the insider versus outsider, there's nothing that I see in the polls that cannot be explained either by reference to the historic 4 factions that my book talks about or with reference to a class-based division. There's no real obvious support for an insider versus an outsider. People are viewing the race through one of those 2 lenses, either class-based or ideologically based. I think you've seen over the last couple of weeks or last couple of months that support for candidates who have electoral experience has risen dramatically, which suggests that as the race gets closer and people take their votes more seriously, they're moving away from what might be a protest support for an outsider and instead moving towards somebody who combines some of the appeal that they like but also has some experience. As far as the political impact of Donald Trump's recent statements, it's too soon to say. I think Donald Trump has his share of people who love him, and they're very steadfast in that support. He has a very high share of people who loathe him. The polls that ask, who would you never support? You know, he leads in the polls when you ask, who would you support? He also leads in the polls among Republican voters when you ask, who would you never support? And that breaks along ideological lines, which is to say that the moderates who do not love him absolutely hate him. And the Tea Party voters who are very conservative, who are not with him, are more open to voting for him, which is, so if he were to make it into a second-round race, he would be able to combine that ideological dynamic. I think what will happen with the Muslim support is it's basically a booted foot on an exposed nerve, which is to say Donald Trump is running a campaign in a way no politician would ever run. He's running on a campaign to inspire both love and loathing simultaneously. And I think you will find that over time that he does not represent a majority of the current Republican Party voting electorate. And I think you will find that he will not be the nominee, but it's too soon to say after his specific statement for me to be sure. Yes, sir. And then I'll come down here for you, sir.
Tim Montgomery from the Times of London. Henry, how much do voters in the early voting states vote more tactically than those in the later states, if at all? In a sense, you can vote in Iowa to put an issue or a candidate or a concern on the agenda, whereas if you're voting potentially later in the cycle, you're actually choosing the nominee, and the point of making a protest vote or making just a stand is less open to you. Is that an important factor?
It is a factor. I think it's also what happens in the later races that there's fewer choice. In Iowa, there tends to be every flavor of candidate. So it's like you turn on your television set today and you've got 32 different channels, and nobody impedes you, so you can choose to watch soccer, or you can choose to watch the news. That's what Iowa was like. So you can make a statement and feel comfortable with that. Very quickly, there is some tactical consideration that goes on, but it's much likelier in an earlier state that people simply vote their heart. Later on, you both have that the race is more important, but also that there are fewer choices. It's like we're back in the pre-cable days where there's only 3 stations. And if you want to watch TV, you have to choose between ABC, NBC, and CBS, even if you might prefer something else. I think in the later races, you see more of that than you see of explicit calculation and tactics, that people take a lesser of two evils approach rather than a tactical approach. So, for example, if the person who liked a moderate candidate finds that by the time their state is voting, that candidate has dropped out, they can choose not to vote, which very few of them actually do, or they can choose among candidates who are their second or third or fourth best choices. And you tend to see that happen, and that's why candidates who get very quick momentum by appealing to one faction quickly find that they get washed out of the race very quickly when it narrows down, because they don't have a broad enough message to attract people who are making second and third best choices. Yes, sir.
Hi, Galen Carey with the National Association of Evangelicals. It's fascinating to me that you have on your screen here 2 Hispanic candidates, and there's also an African American in the mix who's doing pretty well. Yeah, we don't hear much talk about race and ethnicity in either what you said or what the general media is reporting. Why is that, and do you think that below the surface is race and ethnicity playing some kind of role here, and will it in the general election if one of these people is nominated?
Okay, again, 2 questions, one about the primary, one about the general election. The Republican Party primary electorate for many years has been completely non-racial in its orientation, that the race of a candidate or the ethnicity of a candidate has not seemed to matter one way or the other. I mean, you do have natural favorite son effects, which is to say Mitt Romney, who was the first Mormon to run, did very well among Mormons, and so consequently in states with high Mormon populations, he either won or placed, actually he won every state that had a high Mormon population. There are 4 where that's a significant number. I can imagine that in Florida, Marco Rubio, because he's both Cuban and Floridian, would benefit from a double bonus if it were if Jeb Bush had already dropped out, that he would be both the favorite son from Florida, and we can see from elections in the past that there is a state favorite son effect, as well as an ethnic favorite son effect. But other than what I would call the favorite son effect, no, you don't see that at all. In fact, African-American candidates have been running in the past few races, and they tend to do best among the very conservative evangelicals. That Alan Keyes, when he ran in 1996 and in 2000, did best among very conservative evangelicals. In 2012, Ben Carson's doing well among all factions, but the group that he started with the strongest support, and I suspect the group that he will continue to have the strongest support, will be the evangelicals. Race and ethnicity does not seem to be a factor at all in Republican Party primary considerations, apart from what I say, a favorite son effect. In the general election, both of these candidates would like to tell you that there will be a Latino effect if they would be the nominee, because they would be the first Latino candidate. I would give you 2 reasons outside, again, of the Cuban effect, which is distinct, which is to say we know that when an ethnic group that's a minority sees opportunity to elect somebody who is the first of their group, we know that that will produce a higher than normal vote of the favorite son effect. One We do not yet know whether or not Mexicans or Dominicans or Puerto Ricans will have a similar favorite son effect, whether or not being a Cuban translates to being a Latino for a favorite son effect. And I'll also note that Latinos tend to be very liberal on things like economics. That, for example, the Public Religion Research Institute has asked the same question of Hispanic-only polls. And the reason I emphasize that is that means that there's a large enough number of Hispanics in the sample for us to be confident that the numbers are roughly accurate, as opposed to most polls where you ask 1,000 and Hispanics are 120, and the margin of error for that subgroup is incredibly large. And they asked on at least 2 different polls, what of these 2 approaches to economic development do you believe would be best? One is raise taxes and increase spending on infrastructure and education, and second is cut taxes and let private sector grow. By a 59 to 31 margin, Hispanics chose the higher taxes and the more government spending. Mitt Romney got 27%, moving it up to 31% carries no states besides Florida. Yes, Nick, and then over here, and then over here.
Fascinating presentation, Henry. Can I ask you, do the data suggest that this is the most class-polarized nomination race in recent Republican electoral history, or are there antecedents that are analogous to this?
There's no antecedents that are analogous to this, so when you say most, that would be accurate. Traditionally, the Republican Party debate has been about the question of the role and extent of government, and to another extent, to what extent should the Republican Party represent both the disposition and the values of movement conservatism? Each of the 4 factions defines itself in response to those questions. What Donald Trump is doing is saying that's the wrong question. The question is who's winning and who's losing? And I'm on the side of the guys who are losing. That introduces the class-based dynamic, and this is the first time we've ever seen it to that large extent. In 2012, Mitt Romney had a small class-based dynamic, which is to say the richer you were in a Republican primary, the likelier you were to back Romney. But that was the first time that we saw a significant class-based effect, and it was dwarfed by the ideological effects, which is to say that I can explain every state in the Romney-Santorum-Gingrich races better with recourse to the traditional 4 factions than by class. If Donald Trump succeeds in changing the questions that the Republican Party are asking, that would upend the 4 factions. And it would introduce a new factional dynamic, and that would be the first time in modern Republican history. Yes, there was a person over here. Yes, sir, and then down here, up front.
Wilson, AEI. I have a quick question about polarization. And if you think that, on the surface at least, the American people seem a little bit more polarized than they've been in the last 3 elections, and if that if that's true, if that would substantially change the makeup of the 4 different factions that you've laid out, and possibly change the model.
Yeah, there are 2 different questions there, which is the general election electorate and polarization, and secondly, the way that that polarization is infecting and moving Republican Party dynamics. It's quite clear that America is becoming more polarized at a general election level. I think Carlin has produced data on that in political reports. This has been going on for a particularly long time. It's not a post-2008 experience. It's definitely a post-1992 experience. The Democrats have moved left. The Republicans have moved right. People in the center are more numerous, but not necessarily galvanized to do something about it. The post-2008 dynamics have not changed the components of the Republican Party very much. There was a thesis after the 2010 Tea Party victories. Oh, the party has moved so far to the right. Well, actually, none of the factions changed in size appreciably. They were pretty much the same that they were in 2008 and 2000, maybe 1 or 2% more very conservative, 1 or 2% less somewhat conservative. These are not material changes. What does seem to have happened is that the very conservatives seem to be willing, because of what's happened, to work together and seek a consensus candidate more than they might have been in 2008 and 2012. And the somewhat conservative is, although still preferring the sort of person they've traditionally preferred, witness why Rubio is doing better than Cruz at this early stage in the race, is also wanting somebody who expresses more overtly conservative themes than they have in the past. But it's not significantly changing the dynamic. You will still get, if Donald Trump does not succeed in recasting the Republican electorate, you will still get a Republican internal debate on the same question that's been asked for the last 20-something years, which is to what extent should the Republican Party be the vehicle for the disposition and the policy aims of the conservative movement? And it will answer it in the same way that it has before.
Steve Pettit. Given that your data is all from exit polls from the last 3 elections, I want to ask a question about how your analysis is predictive of the behavior of people who don't show up in your data, and that is the approximately 3 million people that came out and voted for John McCain who didn't come out and vote for Mitt Romney the following election.
Okay, that's a general election candidate question, primarily.
But it's a
Right.
It's a Republican cohort.
Right, but there
It
are
doesn't
people
show
who will
up in
vote
the-
Republican in the general election who are not primary participants. We can't be sure how many of the people who voted in 2008, who did not vote in 2012, are Republican primary voters. What I know is that, for example, in 2000, John McCain did attract many moderates who were not habitual Republican voters to the polls. They did not come out again in 2008. That did not materially change the data. The share of moderates in the electorate did go down, but only by a point or two. In New Hampshire, it went from 49 to 45. So it's not nothing, but it's not determinative. Most people vote by habit. Their ideologies are fixed, and the shares of the electorate within a couple of points in any given election are largely fixed, and there's nothing that suggests that's going to change. All of the polls that we're seeing right now at the state and the national level have shares of the electorate, as broken down the way I've described it, they're within 1 or 2 points of the long-term average that the exit poll data that I survey show.
Is there a final question?
Yeah, we're live streaming this as well, so they need to hear you.
My name's Marty Coburn. I'm with the University of Maryland at Baltimore County. What do you judge the possibility of having a brokered Republican convention?
I think it's pretty slim. I think it's pretty slim because of the winner-take-all provisions that will kick in after March 15th, that they will award the lion's share of the delegates to people who win large delegate awarding states. About the only way I could see a brokered convention is if you had a roughly even split of 1/3, 1/3, 1/3 going into those states, and then a roughly even distribution among those states of which of those candidates were to win in relation to delegate shares. Then you would have a situation where early proportionality and later a 3-horse race with everyone staying very tight to one another would produce a situation with no majority. I think that's highly unlikely. I think it's likely you'll have what's traditionally happened, which is a 2-person race at some point, and I also think it's likely that even if you had a 3-person race, that one person's coalition one person would have enough of a lead among certain factions that are strong in the high delegate awarding winner-take-all states that they may not win convincing electoral victories, but they'll win convincing delegate victories, and that means there'll be no brokered convention.
Thank you, and please join me for the reception outside.
Thank you.
We have flyers for the book outside.
I saw you shaking. Yeah. That's what I was going to say.
Thank you. That's fascinating.